Hello, Gary Stromberg.
Well, hi, Rebecca. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome to the Balanced, Beautiful, Abundant Show. I'm so excited to have you as my guest. I've known you for years, and I know that you have a very colorful story, but I have never really got to interview you about it. So I thought this would be a great platform to kind of learn how you became the greatest rock and roll publicist of all time.
Wow, what a title.
Well, I'm very curious. So let me tell my listeners about your incredible roster of superstars that you represented when you were in the publicity firm of GIBSON and Stromberg. So Gary he founded this publicity firm, and he represented, oh my God, my favorite band, the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, Barbra Streisand, Muhammad Ali, BoyzII Men, Earth, Wind and Fire, Neil Diamond, Ray Charles, The Doors, Elton John, Three Dog Night, and Crosby, Stills, and Nash. That is like the best roster ever.
Pretty impressive, huh?
Wow, that is an impressive roster. Gary also co-produced the film Car Wash, and he authored 3 books. One is titled The Harder They Fall. The other is, all right, love it, there it is, Feeding the Fame. And the third is Second Chances. And Gary also sits on the board of directors of several treatment centers for alcohol and drugs. So I want to know, how old were you and how did you know that you wanted to go into public relations?
Wow, I was very young. I went into the Army when I left high school because I was not a very good student and I didn't have the grades to go to college and there weren't any choices for me. And so I went into the Army, which was a terrible mistake. I was a very immature 17-year-old. I had a horrible experience in the Army. I was only in for 6 months in the Army Reserve. I was a clerk typist.
Okay.
Our company motto was, "We never retreat, just backspace."
Did you have to do the private training, get into the best shape of your life for being in the office?
Yes, I had to do that too. Wow. Yes, but it was very intimidating. I was a very immature 17-year-old. I was a mama's boy. To admit it, I was a mama's boy. And the Army was not very kind to mama's boys. So when I got out of the Army, I'm from Los Angeles. I came back home and now I'm 17 years old. I'm full of myself. I think I'm a man now. So I don't want to go back home and I'm on my own. And I gravitated to the Sunset Strip. That's where I hung out. And at that time I had discovered marijuana, I discovered psychedelics, and I just wanted to have fun. That really was my sole intention in life, was to have fun. And what was happening at the Sunset Strip at that time was a lot of aspiring musicians who kind of lived the lifestyle that I saw for myself. Which we slept all day and we hung out all night and we went partied and we went to clubs. And so I was surrounded by people who wanted to be involved in music. I have absolutely no musical talent, but I had the gift of gab. And I talked my way into a lot of things. And what I ended up talking my way into was this business that I knew nothing about, which was PR. And I was told that I would really be good at it. And a lot of these aspiring rock musicians were in need of PR. They were starting their careers. They didn't know how to do it. And so I got talked into it by these young guys who were trying to become known as musicians. And my first 3 clients, and I lived under a lucky star my whole life. So my first 3 clients were Jim Morrison, The Doors, Three Dog Night, and a group called Steppenwolf. They were the first 3 people that I represented. I started
Magic Carpet Ride.
Yes, Magic Carpet Ride, very good.
So they were just guys that you met at the clubs on the Sunset Strip.
Just hanging out, I'm not even sure where I met them, but they were people that hung out.
And they convinced you, we need someone who's one of us, who we can trust to represent us in the world. Will you be our PR guy?
My lifestyle was very much like theirs. So, and they didn't really know what PR was, but this seemed like a way that I could maybe earn a living and have fun. Certainly I get to hang out with these guys. So what could be wrong with that? So I started this little business. I took a small office on the Sunset Strip and very quickly my business took off. And I'm not even sure how that happened, but I guess I had really good instincts. I hired a few people to work for me. Mainly young girls, attractive young girls who these rock you know, young musicians wanted to be around. So that worked well. And just very quickly, one right after another just started coming to my, you know, to my office and hiring me to represent them. So for about, I guess it's close to 10 years, I just got to travel the world hanging out with the greatest rock stars of that generation. And
you were young when this was happening.
I was in my early 20s, yeah.
And
yeah.
all these rock stars started showing up at your door.
At my door, yes. I did not have to pursue them. They sort of pursued me. I got a reputation, my company, and I had a partner too. I mean, I didn't do this alone, but my partner and I, we just developed a reputation of, you know, we knew what we were doing. We loved music. We could talk about it easily. And we lived, like I said, we lived the lifestyle. His name was Bob Gibson. So we were Gibson and Stromberg, G and S. And it was Guzzle and Snort was our nicknames. Bob was a drinker, and I put powders into my face in various entryways. So we became known as Guzzle and Snort. So if you were a drinker and you liked alcohol, my partner was the guy who could handle you. If you took drugs, I was your guy. And that's really how the business started.
Well, I think you had everyone on that list then, because they were all
pretty much, yes. I did. Well, no, that's not fair to say. There were a number of people that drank that Bob was, my partner was, but yes, you're right. So anyway, that's how that career started.
That really speaks into something that I teach. It's like, if you get your mindset right, and you get your law of attraction or your vibration in the right place where you have no resistance, you're just like in the flow, you're in a state of grace, people will show up at your doorstep, and people don't believe that. And here,
that was very true.
Telling me that the greatest musicians and most epic bands of all time, they came to you. So that is just proof that the law of attraction works. So if you're listening to this, it all starts from the inside. It's all about getting your mind right. And you can do
I totally buy that. I had no real training for my career, but I was karmically in the right place.
And you were in flow. You weren't in.
I was in flow. Yes.
You kept saying yes.
Yes. Yes.
That is so beautiful. So what was it like hanging out with these people? I mean, did you go on the road with them? Did you go to parties in Laurel Canyon? I know there's been a couple documentaries.
I traveled the world, Rebecca. I got to travel extensively. I did tours with the Rolling Stones. I did tours with Pink Floyd. I did tours with all of my artists, essentially. So I was on the road all the time, just living the life. Money was pouring into my office. I was just living way beyond my wildest dreams. But I also was, I had a drug habit that wasn't good and progressed, and eventually is what took me down in that career. When I tell my story, I talk about, I call it a victim. I don't think it's a victim. The Peter Principle. Do you know what that is?
I've heard of Peter Pan, but not the Peter.
Well, actually, the Peter Principle is based on Peter Pan. I succeeded to my level of incompetence. And
well,
this would repeat, it was a pattern that would repeat itself. I'm a very good starter. I can talk my way into any situation, even though I don't know what I'm saying or what I'm doing. And I get going and it looks all good, but I reach a level where I'm out of my league. And also in accompanying that with a drug addiction, my career always seemed to find a way to blow up. So I had this wonderful career in PR. It went on for a long time, made a lot of money. I had experiences that you couldn't imagine, but it all came to a crashing halt. I didn't know how to run a business. I spent my money inappropriately. I didn't take care of my business, and it exploded. And my pattern is that because another thing that I suffer from is grandiosity. So.
You can't get more grandiose than being on tour with these
Yeah, no, it's easy to be that way, sure.
Bands. Almost anyone would feel a little bit grandiose. So I understand that, but go on.
It's about the ego, and my ego was out of control.
Yeah.
But when it exploded, what I did, and I repeated the pattern, was I would go somewhere and lick my wounds and come up with a new scheme, a bigger and better scheme, and take your eye off of the mess that I had just created, And I came back in the first instance, I came back with the idea of being in the movie business, and I became a movie producer, and I talked my way into producing the first movie that I conceived of, and it became a big hit. It was a movie called Car Wash, which you mentioned. And when you are associated with a big hit in the entertainment business, you are given the keys to the kingdom. And the keys to the kingdom are not something you should give me, because I didn't take care of the keys very well.
Yeah.
So I did the same thing with this. I started to make a lot of money. I started to get well known in the movie business, and my addiction and my ego just ran away with me, and I blew up that career too. So, you know, it is for me, it's a wildly entertaining story, but it's also a story that has a lot of consequences.
Oh yeah. Well, speaking of stories, like, what is the most incredible, memorable moment that happened on the road with one of these big bands?
Well, there's no one. I was party to and involved in probably the greatest rock and roll tour of all time, which was the 1972 Rolling Stones tour. So you asked me if I wanted to promote anything on this thing. I don't have anything to promote, but I do have something that I'm working on, that I've been asked to do a podcast on that tour. That tour went on for 8 weeks, and it traveled United States and Canada, and it was really an amazing tour. It was the Stones at the height of their popularity and success. And I was, you know, I traveled with them, and I just have some great memories of the hijinks of the Rolling Stones. We took a number, as their PR guy, I had sold a lot of stories to major magazines around the country. So we took a lot of famous writers with us, Truman Capote and Terry Southern, and a lot of really famous, Andy Warhol went with us. And we had a lot of famous people that were accompanying us on the tour. And my job was to kind of look after them as well. So I not only got to be, you know, next to the Rolling Stones on the tour, but I got to hang out with all of these great writers. And so it was a great experience.
So I'm sure you had tons of women, because the Rolling Stones had, I'm sure, a lot of spillover.
I did well with the leftovers, yes.
It's like the show Entourage, you know, Mark Wahlberg brings them in, but then the whole entourage.
Yes, that was accurate in my situation, in my case.
So what was something that Mick Jagger taught you that nobody else could?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me for kind of a secret story of a Jagger, but I will. Yeah, I can answer that one. Normally, I don't reveal stuff that I don't tell anything that is, I think, harmful to any of the people that I represented. That's not what I want to do. But he did have one thing about him that I thought was really insightful. You'll appreciate this too. At the time, probably the pinnacle of success in PR business that you could get would be the cover of Life magazine. Life magazine was the biggest magazine in the country in the 70s. And to get the cover of Life magazine was like out of this world. And I got the cover for Mick. It took a lot of work. It was a major deal, and I was so excited. And we were on the road when they confirmed that he had it. And I ran into his room, all excited. Mick, guess what? I got you the cover of Life magazine. And he said, no, I don't want it. And I was stunned. I said, don't. And what he said to me, and it really was so instructive. He said, never give them all that they want, because if you do, they chew you up and they'll spit you out. Keep them wanting you. Don't let them have everything that they want. So, meaning withhold yourself. And that was very good, sage advice for people in the entertainment business. And he just knew instinctively that if you did everything that they asked you or wanted from you, they'd tire of you. And he wasn't going to let them do that. He always wanted them wanting more. So my job, largely, a big part of my job representing the Stones was to say no to a lot of important publications and a lot of important people. Television shows that wanted him, they would say no all the time.
Did Mick say no because he just instinctively knew what?
He instinctively knew. He had great instincts.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things he's not given credit for, I mean, because he's such a great artist and they don't really probe this area, but he has tremendous instincts as far as who he is and the public's perception of him. He understands that innately, and he makes great decisions for himself. That's why he's been able to survive, I think, as long as they have. because he hasn't made mistakes in terms of his image and keeping the ball rolling for the Stones.
And it's like boundaries, right? That's, you know, in the recovery world, it's about not being a people pleaser and giving everything out, like holding something
Withholding,
back for
yeah.
self-care
Yeah.
and your own
Yeah,
preservation.
it's a good way to look at it.
So that is really cool. So, okay, how did it happen? Like, you're partying with these people. I know you have a book called, you know, The Harder They Run, The Harder They Fall. I mean, the harder they fall, right? But it's the
Yes.
harder they fall, but that comes from the harder they run. What lyric is that from? What song?
Jimmy Cliff.
Yeah, I thought it was reggae. Yeah.
Yes, it is. There's a movie called The Harder They Fall also.
So
I
you're
stole that.
traveling around with all these bands. It's the 70s. You're doing drugs. You're getting women. You're making millions of dollars with seemingly not much effort. Then what happened? Like, how did you fall? What was
My
your
addiction.
bottom?
My addiction caught up to me. I was using ever increasing amounts of drugs, and it just clouded everything in my world. My thinking was askew. My sense of myself was askew. I just thought I knew everything. I wouldn't listen to people. I wasn't prudent running my business, and it all came crashing down on me. So it was a tough pill to swallow. But like I said, at the time I was young and still resourceful. So I invented this career in the movie business, which took off and kind of covered for the mess that I had made in the music business. And I had a shorter run as a success in the movie business, but it too came to a crashing halt because of my addiction and because of my ego and my big shotism. In my recovery program, we have sponsors, and the first sponsor that I had in my recovery program, when I did what we call our inventory, where you write out your life in hopes of learning the lessons of your life, he labeled me a failed big shot. And that, when he said that to me, it really hurt, but he was right. And I've grown to accept it, and I'm very comfortable with that label. That's who I am. I'm a failed big shot. But
I have a worse label. My sponsor, when I read her My Fist Up, said I was a failed sociopath.
good one. I've never heard that one before, Rebecca. Wow. That is good.
A long way.
That is. Anyway, failed big shot totally describes me. And what I've learned I've been sober for 37 years. What I've learned in my sobriety is that, God never intended me to be a big shot. I made a mess of it when I thought I was. So I'm much better off just being, like we refer to, a worker among workers.
One of the things that I've been studying a lot of like leadership models and people, and one of the themes that keeps coming up in a magnetic leader is vulnerability and humility.
Yeah, those are things I never would have aspired to, but you're right. You're totally right.
Things that in the old paradigm of leadership, you would never show vulnerability and humility, but now in this era, it's very attractive to have someone that's relatable, that is just a regular person just like you, rather than someone who's, acting like they're so much above,
Can I say like our current president, or is that?
Please, yes. We'll blow up all the Republican listeners right now, all two of them. Listen, it's okay. Yes, exactly. If you compare Obama, he led with vulnerability and humility.
And grace and dignity.
And our current president, even if you love him, you have to agree that he's not leading with vulnerability and humility. He is leading with ego. So
and arrogance, yes.
Yeah. So it's just different styles of leadership. So
yeah.
I know that you're in recovery. You said 37 years.
Yes.
And what is it like now when it comes to business? You're not leading from your ego. You're being of service, is what it teaches in the 12 steps, to be of service in all of our affairs. So how has that affected your business life differently?
Well, when I first got sober, I was really at the bottom I had lost everything. I had lost my career. I'd lost all my money. The woman that I had lived with for 7 years left me. Really, I was at the bottom, and which was a good place for me, because I needed that kind. We talk about ego deflation at depth, and that's really what I needed. So, and I was at a loss as to what I could do. I could not think of how I could make a comeback this time, because I had been so beaten up. And my sponsor said that I had to find a way to become self-sufficient for my own means. And I just didn't know what that would mean. And he said, you have to get a job, some kind of job. You have to support yourself. So the only job that I was able to find in early recovery was I worked in a boiler room selling typewriter ribbons on the telephone. It was a horrible job. For those of your listeners who don't know what a typewriter ribbon is, there was a thing called a typewriter before we had computers, and they required ribbons to, had contained ink. And I worked in this boiler room making cold calls, trying to sell typewriter ribbons to unsuspecting customers. It was a horrible job, and I was horrible at it. But I showed up every day feeling totally humiliated that this is where my life had come. I was 40 years old. And but I did that, and I showed up every day, and I wasn't very good at it, and I barely eked out a living, but I did. And my sponsor told me, if you do this, one thing will lead to another, and you will get a life back. And that's what happened. I got a life back. I started about, I guess, a year or two later, I started another PR business, but with the intention of not being a big shot, starting a small agency, getting out of the limelight. And that's what I did. And I got married, and we had 2 children, and made a decision didn't want to raise my kids in Los Angeles, because that's where I didn't know how to protect them from the stuff that I grew up with, the glamour and the entertainment business. I didn't want them subject to that. So my wife and I moved to a small town in Connecticut, and where my kids went to a very fine public school, and we just lived a kind of a very modest life. But what happened in that during that time is I started this little PR firm, and we were doing well. And I had this woman who worked for me, who was a writer, and in downtime when we weren't very busy, she would ask me to regale her in stories of my rock and roll life. She loved listening to these stories. And so one day she said to me, you should write a book. She said, you've lived this incredibly adventurous life. And I stopped her right away. I said, no, I'm incapable of writing a book. I was a horrible student. I don't know anything about the English language. I don't understand grammar. I don't know how to spell. And she started laughing, and she said, they have spell check and they have grammar check, and those aren't excuses. She said, what you need to be a writer is the ability to tell a story, and you're a great storyteller. So why don't you tell your story? So I started thinking about it, and what occurred to me was that if I tell my story, I'm going to go right back to the same problems that I had previously, and that's my ego. That I'll start thinking that I'm somebody important and somebody special, and that never serves me well. So I rejected her on that. I said, I can't do it. I'm not going to do it. But I started thinking about it, and what I came up was the idea that I know a lot of people in recovery who, like me, had big careers in entertainment in various aspects of it. I could tell their stories. They've had remarkable lives. They've crashed and burned like I did from addiction, and then they rebuilt their lives in recovery. So I started compiling a list of people that I knew from my music business days. And then I said, why limit it to that? So I included actors, writers, and then I expanded it even further into sports stars and politicians. And I came up with a wonderful list of people that had been sober for a long time who had rebuilt their lives. And Jane, my partner, showed me how to write a proposal, which I did. And I went to Hazelden, which is the largest publisher of recovery books. And they loved it, and they bought it. And so what proceeded was, say it again?
That book was called what?
That's The Harder They Fall. Yeah, that's The Harder They Fall. It contains the stories of 21 people in all of those areas of life.
And they're all sober.
They're all sober. They've all been sober for at least 10 years. That was one of the requirements for me for the book, was you had to be sober for 10 years, because I didn't want anybody that's newly sober that's screaming from the mountaintop, and that, by the time the book comes out, they're going to be back drinking again or using again. So I want people.
What's the common denominator, Gary, and all these people rebuilding their lives from having such a hard fall?
Oh, good question, Rebecca. You ask good questions. I think the common denominator would be, as you suggested, humility and vulnerability. Those are good, two important qualities. These are people who just come to terms with who they are and and become right-sized in recovery. When you're a celebrity, and these are all celebrities that in these various fields that I wrote about, when you're a celebrity, your ego is, you have people that are just kissing your ass nonstop, and what's the word? I lose words these days. I'm getting old. Facilitate,
Yeah.
it's not the right word, but
Enabling.
That's the word I was looking for. You have enablers.
Yeah.
And it makes it very easy to just have it your way. People are all around you enabling you. But in truth, that doesn't serve you well. And if you're an alcoholic or a drug addict, there are real consequences that come into play as a result of nobody telling you to stop or that you have a problem. So these people all had that happen to them, but found their way into recovery and did the hard work that was required to find out who you really are and how to live your life in a more, I'm just going to say responsible, but that's not the right word. Just a more creative and meaningful way.
It's funny because people think, if I can just be a rock star, a movie star, a professional athlete, or a billionaire or CEO, then my life would be happy and I wouldn't have any problems. But yet we see people like Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain and Robin Williams, Marilyn Monroe kill themselves. And it's like, it's hard to believe that doesn't do it, that it's truly an inside job. But because you've been around this, industry and seen these rock stars and movie stars at their worst, maybe speak into that. Like, how can they have all these accolades and all this money and fame, and yet they're suicidal or they're drug addicts?
Well, it's a terrible realization when you come to that point of recognition that this isn't doing it for you. The disease of addiction is the disease of more, and so I always felt that I didn't have enough, even though I succeeded way beyond my mildest dreams. There was always somebody that had a bigger house than me, or had a more fame than I did, or had a prettier woman than I did, or, something more. I was just always driven by this sense of I'm not enough, or there's more out there that I need to attain. And there's never enough. If that's the track that you're on, you're never going to find it. What you and I both know is that's a soul sickness. Mm-hmm. I was missing a spiritual connection that no matter what I attained in my life wasn't going to be good enough or would ever satisfy me. But now in my recovery, with the recognition that there's a power greater than me in my life that I have surrendered to, I'm a much happier camper.
So is that why they kill themselves? So like, I have all this stuff and I'm still miserable?
Yeah, sure.
So there's nothing left for me to do here on planet Earth, so I'm just going to off myself? Or is it just they're in so much pain? Like, what do you think it is?
Well, it's hard to know. That's hard. That's a tough question to know, but I think that's probably certainly a large part of it.
Yeah.
Look, I still feel lousy. I still feel afraid. And I have all this stuff, and it never worked. When the secret to living, as you and I both know, is just simple, service and living helping others, finding a spiritual connection.
Love and service. Absolutely.
Love and service, yeah.
It's all about love and service. So I want to talk about your cancer. What kind of cancer did you get? What stage was it in? And what was your comeback from that? Because I know that was a pretty intense journey for you.
So I was living this sober life and rebuilt my life, as I explained to you. I had been sober 30 years. I had gotten all of my life back. I married, children, career, got a life back. And I pictured myself as a poster boy of recovery. I was physically fit. I was 70 years old. I was running and just everything. My life was wonderful. And then I got diagnosed with leukemia. And I was told that I had less than a 50-50 chance to live. Wow. And that unless I got a bone marrow transplant, I wouldn't survive. And so I asked, what's a bone marrow transplant? What's that involved in that? And they said, well, to get a transplant, it's based on your DNA. You have to find somebody with the same DNA as you. And your DNA is based on your ethnicity. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, that's good. I'm a white guy. I'm in the big group. And they said, not so fast, white boy. You're an Ashkenazi Jew, and that's a separate category, and that's a very small category. So in order to find a DNA match, you're going to have to find another Ashkenazi Jew that has your DNA.
And for those who don't know what that means European Jew.
Yes, Northern Europe, Russia, and Northeastern Europe, I guess.
Okay.
So the process is that for leukemia, the kind that I had, was you had to do chemotherapy, intensive chemotherapy, to kill everything inside of you. And then they search for a match, and you go home to kind of recover your strength back. And then you go back in the hospital and they give you the transplant. Well, I went through the first phase, the chemotherapy, and it did go into remission. So I was sent.
What stage did it in at that point? What stage did it get?
I don't think they have stages for
with
leukemia.
Okay, that's different.
Yeah, it's not. It's a blood cancer. It's not tumor. So it's there's no stages. It's a progressive disease that will kill you unless you get in the kind of leukemia I had, it will kill you unless you get a bone marrow transplant that works, because they don't all work. So I went home, and there's a bone marrow registry, international bone marrow registry, that they begin searching. They put my DNA into the registry and they look for the match. But I was told, because I'm in such a small group, that it's unlikely they'll find a match. But I guess God intervened, and they found a match, a 33-year-old Israeli man who agreed to donate bone marrow to me. I was taken back into the hospital. I was given some more chemotherapy. They sent a courier to Israel to collect his bone marrow. They flew him back, and within 24 hours, I was infused with his bone marrow. And then I began the very tenuous journey into what they hope is recovery. A lot of people don't make it. That's that month or so after you get your bone marrow transplant is very tricky. The body sees the new bone marrow as an invasion, and it fights it. So all kinds of bad things happen in the first month, infections and terrible things. And unfortunately, I didn't have any of those. So my body accepted the bone marrow, and I started back in rebuilding my strength. And I'll tell you one quirky thing that I learned about this process, that I am no longer my own blood type. I am the blood type of my donor. That's how significant the bone marrow transplant. Pardon me?
A total stranger saved your life.
Total stranger saved my life, yes.
What's his name?
His name is Alex Kikas, K-I-K-I-S.
So are you still in touch with him?
So, well, this is a good story too. It takes a couple of minutes to tell it. You want to hear it?
Tell it, yeah.
So, obviously you want to meet your donor. You know, this is such a big thing. This guy saved my life.
Yeah.
So I was told that when the donor, when you get a donor, it gives you bone marrow transplant, you have to wait a year. After a year, you can contact that person. And the reason they wait a year is because should you not make it, they don't want to burden that person with the thought that he wasn't able to save you. That's a heavy thing. So they want you to live at least a year before they'll offer
shows how small the chances are of living even with the correct DNA bone marrow.
Correct. So in case of that, and that's for a domestic donor. For an international donor, which is what I had, they wait 2 years. So I had to wait 2 years before I could even approach my donor. And they don't tell you who your donor is. So in 2 years, I had it marked on my calendar, and I called the City of Hope where I had this procedure done. I said, it's 2 years, can we contact my donor? They said, here's what you do. You write a letter. You don't say who you are or anything. You just tell him you'd like to contact him and tell him a little about yourself. So I wrote a nice letter. They sent it off, and 2 weeks later, I called and said, they said, we haven't heard anything from him. And I was really disappointed. And I said, is there anything I can do? And they said, well, you can write him one more time. But if he doesn't respond, then you need to move on with your life. Just accept that this man gave you a gift and that you have to move on with your life, that he doesn't want to make the contact. And it's understandable how you wouldn't want to make the contact, So I wrote another letter, and I waited the 2 weeks. I called them and they said, he still hasn't responded. So move on. And I was very disappointed. And another week passed, and all of a sudden I got a call from the City of Hope, said, guess what? He's responded. He's willing to meet you. So as it turns out, he is an immigrant from Russia. He was a Russian Jew who immigrated so English is his third language. He speaks Russian and Hebrew and English poorly. So I think he may have been intimidated by the prospect of speaking English to me, but he was on Facebook. So we agreed to become Facebook friends, which we did. And it's very tentative. He can't express himself very well, but at least I see pictures of him. I know who he is. We've exchanged pleasantries. So this went on for a few months. That the City of Hope every year has a bone marrow transplant survivors reunion.
Wow.
Wherein everybody who has successful bone marrow transplant comes together at the City of Hope. There's about 3,000 people that gather every year, and we celebrate. We have this big celebration, and every year they pick one survivor to meet his donor. So 2 years ago, they picked me to meet my donor, and they flew my donor and his wife in from Israel.
Wow.
And they do it like a game show almost. They hide him backstage. They bring me out on the stage to tell my story. I'm in front of a few hundred people. I tell my story and they say, okay, now Gary, here he is. I want you to meet. And I'm starting to choke up now.
No, it's very emotional for you.
And out walks the man.
That's why. You wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for him.
Wasn't here, exactly right. So I just broke down. I started crying and we just embraced each other. I mean, and he's a very shy man. So he turned his back to the audience because he was crying. And he told me afterwards that Israelis don't show emotion. Men don't show emotion. And he was embarrassed that he was crying. So we both stood on the stage and cried. And then
everyone in the audience cried too. So
I think so. I have a video of that. If you want to see it, I'll send it to you. It's really very emotional.
That's so beautiful. So what motivated him to give you his bone marrow? What even put him in that program or gave him an awareness?
As it turns out, in Israel, it's a little different, I think, than the rest of the world. It's required in Israel when you go into the military that they take your DNA and that you go into the bone marrow transplant registry. You don't have to do it. If you're picked as a match, you can say no, but you are in the registry.
Wow.
It's the only country that requires it. So I guess he just had this sense. It's really not that difficult for the donor to do, and you're saving a life. I mean, I can't imagine not doing it. I'll tell you another quick follow-up story to this. So as a result of this happening, my children went on the registry, the bone marrow registry, to be potential volunteers to donate their bone marrow. 2 years ago, I was walking down the street in Santa Monica and I get a text from my daughter. She says, guess what? I said, what? She said, I'm a match for somebody that needs bone marrow. And I mean, I collapsed. I literally collapsed on the sidewalk in Santa Monica. I sat down on the sidewalk. And again, I guess I'm a big baby, but I started to cry. And it turned out, and then this is really amazing. The man who needed her bone marrow was an Israeli.
Ah, incredible.
So she was in a match for an Israeli man. How that's come like full circle.
Well,
and my daughter was going to save the life of an Israeli. It turned out she wasn't the best match. They found somebody. The matches are based on a 10-point system. Mm-hmm. You have to have 10 markers that match in order to be the thing. So, and if you have the 10 markers, then they look further to 11, 12 to see how many markers they can get. The man that they found from this guy in Israel, he found somebody else that was an even better match than my daughter. So they took his bone marrow. So she didn't have to do it, but just that she was picked and that she was a match. And
willing, you know, it's like the guy in Israel, by saving your life, taught your kids a lesson. That through generosity, you
That's correct.
Lives.
That's correct.
Never forget that guy or that lesson, and they'll always think of how they can be of service.
That's correct, Rebecca. Good point.
I'm going to end the interview with this question. Being on stage with the Rolling Stones 1972 in front of tens of thousands of fans, or being on stage with your bone marrow donor, which was more potent for you?
Well, from my ego, it was the Rolling Stones. From my heart, it was my donor. You want to see a picture of me, what I look like with the Rolling Stones? Yeah. I have a picture right on my wall here. I'm going to show you.
Go ahead, share it on the screen. So if you're listening, you can't see it, but we also have this on YouTube. So if you want to look it up on YouTube, it's under Balance Beautiful.
You're not gonna, I don't think you're going to.
Wow.
Can you see? Let's see. That's Mick Jagger in the front.
Yep.
And that's me right behind him. Can you see?
Oh my God, you have a beard and a mustache and a big hat on. That's awesome.
That's that private Rolling Stones. I can't see the plane really.
I can see the plane. I can see the lips on the plane.
The logo, the tongue logo.
Oh, that's so cool. Well, Gary, this has been such a moving and touching interview. And my listeners, if this will help anyone in your life, please share this podcast with them. This is such a beautiful story of how somebody can save each other's life through generosity. Please rate and review it. We've so enjoyed our time with you, Gary, on the Balance Beautiful.
My pleasure, Rebecca.
Show. And how can people stay in touch with you?
I'll give you my email address. You can email me. I guess is the simplest way. It's gary.stromberg, STROMBERG @gmail.
And also your website. I'll put this all on the show notes, garystromberg.net, if you want to keep in touch with Gary. Again, it was just delightful sharing some time with you. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the Balance, Beautiful, Abundant show. And we'll see you soon with another incredible guest. Have a wonderful evening, Gary. It was great spending this time with you. Thank you for your honesty, humility, and vulnerability. It was really touching.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.